Roger Mark de Souza is Director of Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience for the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. He joins us to discuss a number of topics as we head toward July 11th, which is World Population Day.
That's correct, World Population Day.
I was reading a piece that you wrote about demographic resilience linking population, dynamics, environment, and security. That's a long way of saying there's some really interesting things when you look at, say, the relative age of a country and what you might be able to predict about political stability and other things. Tell us about that.
I think it's very good framing, John. It's not just political stability. I think it's overall stability and well-being of a country and a community at various levels. So one of the things that we know, for those of us who work on this very popular buzzword resilience at the moment, is we're looking at ways that communities and systems respond to disruptions. And an important part of that is that they're able to learn from it, plan from it, and do better. And this whole idea and concept of demographic resilience is something that I am putting forward to say that if you really care about how we can address in a very innovative way these critical issues around resilience, you must look at demographics.
So you're offering a new lens, essentially. So rather than talk about the resilience of your infrastructure or of your food supply, you're saying, look at your population and look at what you know about.
And I would say not instead of, I say together, because very often we talk about the resilience in addition to. And that breaks down, I think, into three critical areas. It's looking at age structure and what that means, particularly when they're very young populations.
Studies that show the younger the population, the more likely there is to be violence.
The more likely there is to be conflict, yes. So generally, we know that the research shows that when more than 40% of a population is very young, that it serves as a multiplier for additional conflict and violence within the community. So the age structure of a community is very, very important.
And you mentioned other
there are
points.
A couple other variables that are also quite salient. One is urbanization. We know that there's an urban advantage because of economies of scale, because of a concentration of people, but there's increasing marginalization in urban settlements, particularly in vulnerable, fragile settlements,
and
slum areas.
And half of us live in urban settings.
Right, just more than half globally live in urban settings. And many of those are in very vulnerable parts of the world, like the Sahel, like South Asia, Southeast Asia, like the Horn of Africa. But even for us in the United States, we are also vulnerable to these shocks. And you have to think about how you do urban planning and how you manage population dynamics in an urban setting.
You mentioned the term shocks, and I want you to, for people who aren't as well versed in this as you, to differentiate between shocks and stresses.
So shocks is a short-term disruption. It may mean an outbreak of conflict, change in food prices or price fluctuations. It may mean a sudden storm, an actual disaster. And a stress is sort of long-term ongoing stresses, sort of subtle changes due to climate change impacts, for example.
So, well, this is where the environment overlaps with some of these scenarios. So in the background, this buzz, maybe water supplies are dwindling.
Exactly.
Crops aren't what they used to be because of changes in climate. This exacerbates what's already a bad situation.
This exacerbates what's already a bad situation. And you look at an area like, let's say, the Sahel in Africa, about 20 million people are food insecure. And it's a very young population. So you have to bring those factors together. You're looking at water, drought, food security, and population dynamics in a very integrated way.
It's so complex that I barely know where to start in some cases. But another layer to add on to this, you quote a RAND report and talks about this term, urbanization of insurgency.
Yes.
So this actually also can have an impact on recruitment of terrorists?
Precisely. What we find that is increasingly there is a greater recruitment of terrorists in urban areas. And when we do military planning and think about how we respond to this, this is a new dimension that we find that has changed the parameters and how we look at anti-terrorism efforts. So you're looking at instability and vulnerabilities in an urban setting, overlaying that with demographics, recognizing that this has threats to the overall well-being that could include terrorism. And you need to plan for that. How do you plan for that? How do you anticipate that? How do you measure success in that area? How do you mobilize the development community, the security community, the humanitarian community to come together and act on this?
So now that we've created this matrix, this
Yes.
puzzle, this really complex, it's chaos and complexity theory poster child.
Yes.
What are the solutions? What can be done?
I think one of the major things, and this is something that we've highlighted in a report that was called A New Climate for Peace, commissioned by the G7, to think about how we address these issues in a very connected way. And we are stressing that you need to look at a local level and bring in local, on the ground members of the community who are facing these threats at the front lines, to think about what kind of information is useful for them to predict what's going to happen.
So you're starting in the trenches, not with the big global view.
No, we're starting in the trenches, but also collecting that data and thinking, how can you anticipate that a shock will happen, and what will you do once it happens?
As a discipline or approach to problem solving, is
Yes.
this in its infancy? Or how far along is this?
That's a really good question. I think it's no longer in its infancy. It's a field that has been developing for about 20 years. It's being recognized in policy circles and programmatic circles. So it's being applied on the ground. We're learning. There's still gaps in knowledge, and we have to think about innovative ways to bring additional actors on board. How do we engage the private sector to think about how we respond to this? What does it mean for community well-being? So in terms of the theory and the understanding behind it, we're very well set. We're looking at how do you operationalize this? How do you make this real on the ground? How do we learn from that? And then how do we measure our success?
What I'd love to do in one of our future discussions in this ongoing series of discussions is select a case study where we can apply the things you've just described and see how it's tracking.
I think that would be very insightful, because we have examples from the Horn of Africa, from Ethiopia, from Somalia, that are quite instructive with regard to thinking about how these issues are connected and what we're learning.
Well, for people who are interested, a wealth of material available on your blog and on the website.
At newsecuritybeat.org, and also at newclimateforpeace.org.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you
Always
very
interesting.
much. Thanks.